Again, I'm Rodney Dawson, Curator of Education at the Greensboro History Museum, and this is our Minding Our Monuments, Discovering Lost Pieces of Greensboro History in Public Spaces. And the series will launch our webinars for the year, and hopefully I'll remember to hit the button to record it, which, as you can tell, I did that. But we got a lot of great guests here. We're gonna run it tonight, which is March 15th. Then we have March 22nd with Jose Vasquez from the Monument Lab. We're going to skip a week on March 29th, and then we'll resume on April 5th with Sage Chioma and Solomon Titus. They're descendants of Ishmael Titus, who was a Black Revolutionary War soldier and fought at the Battle of the Guilford Courthouse here in Greensboro, North Carolina. And then we'll wrap up things on Tuesday, April 12th with John Reese, who's the author of written several books, but one in particular, They Were Soldiers. And then also joining him will be Trevor Freeman, who's the public programming coordinator for the Western North Carolina Historical Association. But tonight, we're honored to have with us one of the instructors over at local school, North Carolina A&T, Professor Ernest Hooker. Thank you for joining us on tonight. And then we saw their names in the slide, but you can see their faces up here as well. But Joni McMaster, she volunteered. She's also an intern that helped put this together as far as research. Bianca Cobb, local Greensboro resident, who also volunteered, as well as all the way in Berkeley, California, but with some North Carolina ties, Joanna Foley, and she's having a little listening party with her friends over in Berkeley, California. You can see them. Thank you all for joining us. They ate some chocolate cake in front of us earlier, but it's okay. It's all right. I know Joni will visit us and she'll bring some cake with us, but thank you all for joining us as well. And little housekeeping rules. If you look at the bottom of your screen on the icon, the Q&A function, you can use that for question and answering. We hope to reserve the latter part of the program, the last 10 minutes or so to answer some of those questions. But in order to keep it engaging, I might pull up a question at any time. And then also our panelists here may pop in with a question or two as well. And so, like I said, Professor Hooker, I'm gonna start out with asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself and why you're so passionate about this subject. And off mic before we started, we said a prayer and we were talking about the situation over in Ukraine. And he's a fellow veteran of mine who also was over at Persian Gulf at the same time I was. So military history is one of your research specialties, but tell us a little bit about yourself before we get started.
I am Ernest Hooker. Good evening to you guys, and thank you for having me as your guest lecturer today. My name is Ernest Hooker. I am originally from Los Angeles, California. I am a Gulf War Air veteran, as Rodney mentioned, but also I grew up partly with my dad. My dad is a retired Air Force senior master sergeant. Grew up traveling the world with my father, and I'm kind of glad that Rodney reached out to me because, and I'll share this a little bit later about my experiences seeing different murals and paintings and sculptures outside of the continental United States. Right now, I'm the military history instructor at North Carolina A&T. Miss McMaster was one of my students, so delighted to see her volunteering. And so my interest in military history kind of grew out of my military career. I got my bachelor's degree in history and got my master's degree in history, secondary education, with a minor in museum studies. And I was delighted to come back, was asked to come back and lead the military history as a part of the ROTC program. I have been at North Carolina A&T going on 10 years. It's been a wonderful, wonderful time teaching and seeing the ROTC program grow. We about 3 years ago, we had a cadet who graduated who ranked in the top 20 nationally, competing with West Point and other institutions. And so I continue to, value education inside and outside of the classroom. I'll also collect military artifacts, which is part of my background. I've done things at the Black Theater Festival. I've done exhibits for the Black Theater Festival. I've done some at Bennett College. I did one at the Dudley Gallery on A&T's campus. And just recently, I did one at the Greensboro Swarm game. I'll tell you, it was kind of funny because I was able to set up a Tuskegee Airmen exhibit. And the next day, I got a phone call, and it was an executive from the Hornets there. Michael Jordan kind of wanted to know, why it is an exhibit up there at the Charlotte Hornets. So hopefully next year, they're willing to invite me and set up an exhibit there. Because I told them, it's one thing, and we'll talk about it tonight, is that museums and sculptures represent a story. It's just not something that's just erected. It tells a story, and I'm glad that you guys invited me. I hope to share some great information with you tonight and take questions and answers. But that's a little bit about my background.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And we look forward to learning more with your presentation today. I know we're going to talk about some sculptors that we may be familiar with and some we may not, but two in particular. And I think both of them, first name Ed.
Yes.
Yeah, so Ed Dwight and Ed Dixon. And so I'm going to give you the floor and let you take it away.
Okay. So for tonight's discussion, I want you guys to capture in your mind what sculptures and how they tell a story, and then the makeup of sculptures and why they are erected. And then think in your own mind, you may have someone in your family who may have been part of a event throughout history. And so when their story is being told, monuments go up for many reasons, dates and numbers, but what's important is why. And to understand sculptures, the texture, how it's made, and then the story goes along with it. A lot of times, as I've been teaching, and especially for college students and high school students, a monument is just something that they see. But the thing that, what needs to be understood is what message did that sculpture tell? What painting does that story tell? What can you take from? What can you learn? Again, picture someone in your family may have done something monumental. And so it's not just a street marker, it's something that tells a story. And so one of the things I want to share before we get into Ed Dwight is that when I lived in the Philippines, we talk about culture. Culture is also important as to the reason why exhibits are erected. When I was in graduate school, I read a book called, it was talking about way monuments and things had, the side of the story, and it had to deal with the Enola Gay exhibit, which is in Pearl Harbor. So what side do you tell? The Japanese, from the Japanese perspective, or from an American perspective? And so when I was overseas and stationed in the Philippines, we seen the buffalo was significant to the Filipino culture, which is Tagalog. And so we walked downtown Baguio. that's the first time I've seen a sculpture of Vietnam veterans with a water buffalo attached to it. And so I asked my father, it's just a buffalo, it's just an animal. But as we began to learn from the locals there, I began to understand the significance of the buffalo. So if you go to Washington, D.C., there's a sculpture of two veterans and a water buffalo, and it's a very significant animal to the custom of the Philippines as well as the Vietnamese. So in tonight's talk, we're going to talk about Mr. Dwight and his travels and his idea of what captivated him to even make sculptures. And I think the sculptures, again, tell a story. They're all over the country, particularly African Americans. It's not that it's been misunderstood, it's been misrepresented. And what we hear today is to educate and learn more about local sculptures and markers that may be in Greensboro, that may be in your local area, It's just not something that's erected. It's something that tells a story. So, but before we get started, I'm just going to share with you two of my exhibits. They're not necessarily sculptures, but they're mainly exhibits. Just give me 1 second. Okay. Can everybody see it?
I can see it.
Okay. So this was a paying tribute to the Tuskegee Airmen. This was done at the High Point Museum. And so what you're really looking at is a World War II mask, pilot's mask, along with the little thing that the parachute comes out of. That's the life jacket. And then you have two pictures, which were war bonds that were done in World War II. And this was done at the museum in High Point. And so what you're looking at is a reproduction of an African-American Tuskegee Airman. This gentleman here was the general. He was the one that was speaking at this particular event. And so these are the types of events that I set up and help tell the story. So individuals walk up and I kind of give them information about the Tuskegee Airmen. Okay. Everybody see it?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so when I started, when Rodney reached out to me about sculpturing, again, I was delighted. That's not my area, but historically, Black sculptures have been around. When I was reading Mr. Dwight's bio, they became very prominent around the 60s and the 70s, and there were some before, but the 60s and the 70s, you're looking at the civil rights movement, okay? And his idea was to look at what was going on at the time period and try to, after he got out the service, and I'll go into in just a minute, of how to represent African culture in a very positive way. Also looking at his bio, I can see he was influenced a lot with some of the earlier artists doing the Harlem Renaissance with jazz, ragtime jazz, poetry. And that's kind of how, when I looked at his bio, I said, well, man, this was a man ahead of his time, but he embellished in his growing up early, and then he embellished in his military career to make these wonderful sculptures to come to light. And so this is an art form. This is in the discipline, but he took what he learned and then made it more public. And so that's somebody who's a public historian or someone who does public sculptures. And so it's a lot of thought process that goes into it. So let's learn a little bit about Ed Dwight. As you see here, a picture that I found, him working on two sculptures. And sometimes sculptures could be something that you find at a store. If you go to a museum or an art show, sometimes you'll find small sculptures that are a reflection of the time period. So a lot of his work, you'll see it reflects the time period and the era. Edward Joseph Ed Dwight was born September 9th, 1933, to George Baker Dwight and Edward Dwight Sr. His dad played for second base and center field for the Kansas City Monarchs. I found that very important. And the reason why I say that, because this is the time of segregation, as he notes in some of his works, is that it's like living in two societies. One where, he's growing up, he's kind of confined, but his father, was talking about don't take things as it is. And so when I found out that he played for the Monarchs, baseball was segregated. You had the Negro Leagues, and then you had Major League Baseball. Now you're talking about before, Jackie Robinson, or right around that important time. And when you think about the 1920s and the 1930s, we're coming out of World War I. You have the Tulsa, Oklahoma riots, which we'll talk about a little bit. And then you have segregation in, between the Negro League and the Major League Baseball. And so he looked at that as the starting point of him wanting to be a sculptor. At the age 4, Dwight built a toy airplane out of the orange crates in his backyard. So what I took from him, he's very hands-on. Reminds me of a little bit of what Booker T. Washington was talking about, industrial education and trades, learning to work with your hands. So he thought that that was so much of a skill. He attended grade school at Our Lady Perpetual Help in Kansas City, which was a Catholic school. I found that very interesting that he went to a private and a Catholic school early on. And you don't find, that's more like mainly in the Midwest. And so it's you don't find that too much of an African-American going to a Catholic school, particularly a private school. But even during Reconstruction, after Reconstruction, especially up north, some Blacks did go to these private schools. Some of his early life, you see him sitting here with his pants, and he has this plane, and this is kind of what he envisioned of wanting to go into sculpture, but wanting to join in the military. As a child, he was an avid reader and talented artist who was mechanically gifted and enjoyed working with his hands. And again, this had a lot to do with his father. While delivering newspapers, he saw an Air Force pilot, Dayton Ragland, a Black man from Kansas City, on the front page of a local newspaper called The Cow. So this is where he saw the image. And sometimes when you see an image, it evokes you to activism depending on this time. And being that he was delivering local newspapers, he would see these kind of, you think about social media today, you kind of, everything's every day hitting your face. But back during this time, being that he was delivering a local newspaper, he was able to look inside of it, look at the image, and that inspired him. Having grown up in a racist segregation, he instantly wigged out, becoming inspired to be a pilot. And this is where so what he thought of is, when he's looking at this image, again, picture you being 14, 15 years old, in the 1920s. He said, this is a quote from him: "This is insane. I didn't even know they let Black pilots get anywhere near airplanes." And so when you think about Blacks in the military, they were barred, especially in the Air Force. The Air Force was extremely against Blacks being in the military. And for him to envision that as a young kid, saying that, hey, I didn't even know I can get next to a plane. But there were certainly, when he looked at that newspaper, it let him know that, hey, at some point, this person may have did a lot of things, even to fly a plane. And what's interesting, if you didn't know, as far as an African American getting in a plane, speaking of the Tuskegee Airmen, Eleanor Roosevelt, went to, if you watch the movie, she went to the airfield in Alabama, and she wanted to go up in the airplane. And the commander at the time said, well, I'll have one of my white pilots, put you in the plane and take you. She said, no, I want one of the African Americans. And it wasn't necessarily, it was about race. She wanted to make sure that they were just as trained as just as the other soldiers. Now, in terms of the segregation, Mr. Ragland had to deal with waiting in a room for long hours, even to go in there and take the test to be a pilot. In 1951, he became the first African-American male to graduate from Bishop Ward High School. This is the high school he went to. And again, he was an avid reader. He loved to work with his hands. And again, this is what envisioned him, that helped him to move later on into his career. His military career, what you see here is a picture of him getting ready to get into an airplane, which is a fighter pilot. You can see his uniform with all the things that, for example, his helmet, the little sling thing, the thing that you're looking at, that's in case he have to eject himself out of the airplane, and it has a parachute in there. Dwight enlisted in the United States Air Force in 1953. My grandfather also, who fought in the Korean War, was an Air Force pilot too as well. And so that's right around the Korean War, which the Korean War was very short. He completed his airman and cadet pre-fighting training at Lackland Air Force Base near San Antonio, Texas. We were stationed at Brooks Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas, and you have Lackland Air Force Base, and that is one of the biggest bases where they had cadet pre-flight training. And from reading his bio, he also experienced, he encountered discrimination there. Again, having to wait hours and hours to get flight time. But just like him working with his hands, he persevered and continued on. And Dwight traveled to Mayodan Air Force Base in Maiden, Missouri to finish his primary flight training. And what's interesting about his story is that most of the Tuskegee Airmen were school teachers. Him in particular, he was just someone who grew up working with his hands, came from a small town, and he wanted to be a pilot. Most of the Tuskegee Airmen were school teachers. In particular, Winston-Salem State was a teachers' college, and a lot of those Tuskegee Airmen some came from Winston-Salem, some came from Greensboro, and then a lot of them transitioned down south to Alabama. And so by him, being in that, after that window in the 1950s, things were still, the military was still, it was integrated, but not fully. And I'll tell you, and the reason why is that Executive Order 9981, which came under the Truman Doctrine, is where the integration, but fully integration doesn't happen until the 1960s when you get to the Vietnam War. And he talks about a lot of that, when he starts doing these sculptures. He earned a commission as an Air Force second lieutenant in 1955. Dwight attended night classes at Arizona State University until 1957. And then I found out, and from talking to Rodney, I found out that he entered pre-astronaut training, and that even with someone like Ronald McNair, who was in the Air Force, he took up aeronautics. And again, the thing that I'm, very, it intrigued me is that, again, he's working with his hands. He goes to a Catholic school, then he later goes to a public school, and he's inspired. He's he's delivering a local newspaper, and he gets to the point where he wants to take up pre-astronaut training. And I did not know, and I know this from my uncle who worked at Kennedy Space Center in Cocoa Beach, Florida. In the 1960s, even the the Kennedy Space Center was segregated, meaning that they had to go to separate bathrooms. They had separate hubs. And so if you can picture your mind, again, what he went through. In 1961, the Kennedy administration selected Dwight as the first African-American astronaut trainee. So he became the first trainee after the suggestion of the National Urban League, Whitney Young. So what also helped him is the NAACP, but certainly the National Urban League was pushing for more Blacks to be, is particularly in this instance, we're talking about Mr. Dwight to take up pre-astronaut training, okay? Dwight proceeded to phase 2 of the Aerospace Research Pilot School, and it is here when they go through all types of training, weight, aeronautics, math and stuff, and math that get the right configurations when they go up in space. So it was a very rigorous school. From looking at his, reading his bio. He resigned from the Air Force in 1966, claiming, according to The Guardian, that racial politics had forced him out of NASA and into the regular officers course. And during the 1960s, it was very, very racial within the Air Force. Again, you have the Army, you had the Marines, but the last organization to accept Blacks was the Air Force. And a lot of times when you think about the Tuskegee Airmen, it costs money to train soldiers in 2 separate spaces. And that's what the War Department did a study, and they basically said that the military was not going to be used as a social experiment. And so I concur with what he had to go through, but that didn't stop him. Again, racial politics had forced him out of NASA. And I mentioned that, yes, at NASA, the bathrooms were segregated, but a lot of the African Americans did a lot of the math, did a lot of the groundwork, and didn't get credit. But here it is, a government entity that steals racist. So it's, I refer to this as like, living in the Jim Crow South, where even in public spaces, such as a government place like NASA training, that you still have that Jim Crow mentality where Blacks are considered less than in terms of their occupation and skill, not in terms of their skin color, but I think it's important for us to understand that Mr. Dwight was just as good. So we're talking about the matter of occupation and opportunity. We're not necessarily focusing on their skin color. This selection garnered international media attention. He was one of the first pilots to be, if you know anything about the Jet magazine, I was able to find this photograph. It said, "Why Dorothy Dandridge is broke. Report the first Negro astronaut training." Is what you're looking at here is the early Jet magazine, and he got international, fame for this because of him being on the Jet magazine, and even overseas, it had sort of an international appeal. Again, consider the time period of an African American. Of course, this is a Black magazine, but still appealing across the board. And the reason why I, like to mention this is that because in looking at his career going overseas, even Rodney may know this, they have a different respect for people folks who are in the military when you're talking about international appeal. And so this was very significant because now the negative images that were portrayed of African Americans during World War II were, Joe Louis, they call us goops and monsters, but here it is, very distinguished. If you look at his uniform, he looks very tight knit. So when I saw this, it made me think that he's rising above the challenges that he's facing. Dwight is a sculptor, okay? After resigning from the Air Force, Dwight worked as an engineer in real estate and for IBM. Dwight was also a successful construction entrepreneur and occasionally built things with scrap metal. So a lot of his work, early on was built from scrap metal. And then as he moves later on, there's be certain material that he uses for these sculptures. Dwight's artistic interest in sculpting and interest in learning about Black historical icons grew after Colorado's first Black lieutenant governor, George L. Brown. Again, he's basically get inspired by what he sees in front of him. And for him to take up sculpture in the interest of learning more about Black historical figures is important. Now, most of your Rosa Parks, your Martin Luther King, and other sculptures, yes, they're very iconic, but he's doing this at sort of a grassroots level by picking up historical things that people may not know about, which is why we're here tonight. George L. Brown commissioned him to create a statue for the Statue Capitol building in 1974. And for African American to get someone to commission a sculpture, it takes a lot of hard work. But this was I'm not saying that he didn't necessarily care about that. He did, but he was more wanting to erect these sculptures to kind of have a different narrative for African Americans. Dwight moved to Denver and earned an MFA degree in sculpture from the University of Denver. So now here it is the school. You can see from what we talked tonight that schooling has been there, but also him being able to apply with working with his hands. Here's some of his sculptures. You have the Soldier Memorial, Lincoln University, Jefferson City, Missouri. This work was commissioned by Lincoln University to honor the Civil War soldiers and the white officer, Captain Foster, that founded the university as a mecca of higher education for Black soldiers that fought so valiantly in the 1800s. This assemblage is installed on the campus main and is part of a larger rebuilding and expansion program. And so they continue to erect these monuments. Now, what you may not know is that after the Civil War is over with, a lot of HBCUs was funded by ex-Black African-American Civil War soldiers, as well as whites. One in particular, when you think about Howard University, General Oliver Howard was instrumental in finding Howard University. And even here in North Carolina, after the Civil War, North Carolina is not really, when you talk about the Civil War, it's really not mentioned, but a lot of African Americans went to certain HBCUs to get an education. But yes, these soldiers were very instrumental in Lincoln University and other universities that came after doing Reconstruction. Underground Railroad Memorials, Detroit, Michigan, Windsor, Canada. As you can see, I wasn't able to really get into what kind of texture to use, but I know that a lot of it's very expensive to erect these sculptures, but when he gets commissioned, a lot of that money comes from, could come from the city or, private donors who have a invested interest in erecting these monuments. Commissioned by Detroit 300 Commission. These two sculptures honor the involvement of Detroit and the state of Virginia in the Underground Railroad. And that's what's unique about Mr. Dwight, is that most of your unknown stuff, he makes sure he highlights that, which I think is very important. The monument recognizes their network of operatives, safe houses, and they're serving as points of junction to Windsor, Canada. Again, we're talking about going through the Underground Railroad, getting to parts of Canada, getting out of the South. So for him to focus on that, again, it basically is telling you a story more from a sculpture perspective to get to the public to understand the importance of the Underground Railroad. It also honors the city of Windsor and the state of Ontario as points a willing embarkation for safe refuge for thousands of African Americans. So it's basically a stopping point where they were taking these these African Americans. Dizzy Gillespie, I found this to be one of my favorites. That's because I like jazz. I had lately in the last 4 or 5 years, and I also, I have a podcast radio, and so I've been really digging deep into jazz. So Dizzy Gillespie, of course, if you go back to the Harlem Renaissance, where African Americans, and I use this with my students, we have sort of a bottom-up culture, and I don't say that in a negative sense, which means that from the depths of despair, that's what the creative, artistic development of African American creativity comes to the rise because of the trials and tribulations that they face. Commissioned by the city of Chickasaw, South Carolina, to create a memorial sculpture of great jazz trumpeter Dizzy Gillespie in his birthplace of Dizzy. The over life-size sculpture is installed in the downtown city square. So many of these sculptures are in public places where you can see them. Some of these sculptures is not in the most visible area. And so again, looking at Mr. Dwight, he was making sure that they were going to be done properly. And then also that they just tell a story. So they're just not something that's sitting up. Denmark Vesey, Charleston, South Carolina, commissioned by the nonprofit Denmark Vesey Memorial Committee. And that's also important. A thing that he saw is these nonprofits, supporting or getting funds for erecting these monuments. This sculpture tribute honors the patriot and anti-slavery advocate Denmark Vesey and his associates. The memorial features oversized sculpture of Vesey and top 2 lieutenants in honor of the 1822 slave rebellion in Charleston, South Carolina. And we all know, if you didn't know, Charleston, South Carolina is a very historic place. Also was the largest port for the importation of slaves. As he said, the memorial resides in a large plaza of City Park adjacent to the Citadel. Citadel is a historic university. Memorial features 4 bronze storyboards telling the story of Vesey's life, the rebellion activities in the early 1800s. And this was installed in 2013. So when I looked at his page, I wanted to give you guys a different selection of some of his monuments and, again, what the story tells. As we close out, this is one of my favorites. This is Miles Davis. And for him, looking at Mr. Dwight's various sculptures. Here's some of his Mega Everest Memorial, Alcorn State University, sculpture memorial to the inaugural ceremony of President Barack Obama, which is a traveling exhibit. The Tulsa Race Riot Memorial, City of Tulsa, which is when they had the Tulsa riots right after World War I, when you had Black Wall Street. Darren Williams, ex-Denver Bronco player, Congressional Black Caucus Foundation of Washington, and then also Jesse Owens Sports Hall of Fame in Montgomery, Alabama. And so one thing I just want to note, it's another person, if you might want to look him up, and that's Ed Dixon, who put up the Buffalo Soldier Monument, which is in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. He's also a lot of these Black sculptures that I found became very prominent in the 1960s, 1970s, and the 1980s. And then the Buffalo Soldier Monument was commissioned by Colin Powell. And I'm wondering, and I think I'm going to do more researches. I'm wondering if him and Colin Powell or any other has some interaction with some of the more military sculptures. And so that concludes my presentation. Thanks again for your undivided attention. I really enjoyed doing this. It opened my eyes to me as a historian, some things I may not have known. But I think that as I close out, I think that more emphasis should be paid attention to sculptures that may be in cities, and maybe there's commissions that can preserve some of these artifacts or erect some of these artifacts. It'd be interesting to see with things that are going on now, what 10 years from now, what sculptures may be erected that signify the last 10, 15 years. But thank you again, and I'm open to any questions.
And thank you, Professor Hooker. Appreciate that. And I should say that Joanna Foley, who's in the background there, she reached out to Mr. Dwight, and I actually spoke to him. And he is, like you say, born in 1933, so he's right at 89 now. And he very much wanted to be a part of this webinar discussion. However, he's having some health issues and causing him to have several appointments. And so it just wasn't best for him to attend. But I am going to send him a copy of this so that he can view it whenever he's able. But he's very much in support of what we're doing and sends his thank you to that. And he does this himself. He does presentations himself when he and his Joanna's in the background. I don't know if it's he and his granddaughter or he and his daughter. I can't remember. But he and a family member do that. And I do have a question. Then remember, if you have a question yourself, just put it in the Q&A icon. I tried to answer some that were there. But in your research, you talked about how Mr. Dwight in his early going used scrap metal. Why do you believe that was? You think it was because of cost or what?
I think it was because of cost and the fact that, it's just, when it's like, as a kid, you're using what resources are available to you, to make something that you think is important. So as a kid, I mean, think about it, he's born in 1933. We haven't even got to, to World War II yet. And so him being his story just delivering newspaper is what stood out to me. So I'm not surprised he used the newspaper to make a paper airplane. So I think that when he used scrap metal, it was just out of, the availability of resources that he had. And that would be something I would probably, research, as, what stuff that he had available to him. But again, a kid with that kind of imaginary mind is going to use what's best available to him. And then if you look at from where he started at to where he began, that thing was always, and the most important thing I think to take away is, yes, he's using scrap metal, but he's using his hands and his mind to look at what's in front of him to create, to use that scrap metal. And then later on, now he's making, big monuments. So, maybe from his story, he envisioned that taking something smaller and then it evolving.
Yeah, and one of our viewers, Pat, is chiming in. Used to be a sculptor as well, and saying scrap metal is dirt cheap. Mm-hmm. And so that very well could be the case. And then before Bianca or Joni or anyone that has a question, do you think his experiences in the military while he was in the Air Force influenced him heavily as to why he so focused on representation?
Yeah, I would say that. I mean, in the 1950s in particular, and I learned this from my father and grandfather, the idea of being segregated, and in his mind, he wanted to create a different narrative that people would be proud of. He knew that his circumstance that placed him kind of invigorated him to say, okay, how can I change this narrative? Well, I'll do it through the use of sculpture. And then imagine yourself waiting outside a room to take a test for hours and hours before they bring you in and being told that you didn't measure up. So to answer your question right now, I would say that his experience in the military kind of influenced him. I don't think he was so much caught up on stature. I think he was caught up on saying, hey, this is wrong, but let's make the wrong right by creating a positive image for African Americans, and not to exclude the women at the time. Maybe he saw that as an influence in his sculpture, but I think that his military had kind of pushed the envelope even further, because you remember him going to seeing that picture on a newspaper and saying, well, if I join the military, I can get next to the plane. Now he got that opportunity, and it was tough for him. So he said, well, I'm going to resign because of the racial tension. He didn't really, it's not that he gave up. In his mind, he wanted to create a different dynamic for African Americans. And especially during World War II, they use this narrative of, gooks and monsters, where he said, well, I'm going to create a different monster that people can, attract to. So I think that this kind of helped him build the monuments and sculptures that he has up today.
And I do have one question from YouTube, but I'm going to give Joni or Bianca an opportunity to ask a question if you have one.
this is Joni. I'm sorry. And my question is, Joanna had mentioned that there aren't any African-American sculptures at the Guilford County National Military Park.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any other locations in the city of Greensboro that you would like to see more monuments or statues?
I think that, speaking of the National Military Park, because African Americans fought in the American Revolution, yes, I would say yes. Going back to A&T, we have the A&T 4, but it's not visible to the street. It's visible to within its own area, and that becomes very problematic. I mean, if you think about Martin Luther King, most of the Martin Luther King streets is in underserved areas. So it's an American icon sculpture. It's not that it's black or white. It's a sculpture that needs to be presented and preserved in the forefront. These sculptures are not meant to evoke emotion or for people to take sides. It's a monument that's a reflection of the stories of African Americans, just like Caucasians in particular. And I think that we need to understand that and value the sculpture for what it represents. And I think that this is getting misunderstood, but to your question, the only way we're going to do that is find out these stories and work with these sculptures. And again, these nonprofits in the city of Greensboro to get these monuments erected. The National Military, I haven't seen anyone. There's a guy named Ned Griffin, which I'm sure is at the Greensboro Historical Museum, because I played in for many years. You don't see any kind of monuments that represent African Americans in other areas. And that's why I'm grateful for the A&T 4, but again, it's not visible. It's only visible to the campus.
And go ahead, Bianca.
I was just going to piggyback off of that question. I was going to ask, what do you think are some things that we can do to try and, especially within our local community, get those monuments erected? Do you have any suggestions on that?
I think what you have to do is create some kind of commission on preserving monuments and getting monuments erected. Try to get city funding or work with some of these nonprofits that are in the arts. And I'll say this, I mean, every year, the Humanity Arts Council gives out tons of money for the renovation or, the erection of projects. And we have to make sure that we create these committees or commissions that are ran by citizens and people who are in position to take these things to city council. Not to say that, hey, we want this in this area, but to say, hey, there's a lot of history in Greensboro. How can we make these monuments or other things that represent the diversity in Greensboro, African American, Hispanic? Until that's done, just, the people who are on here tonight, you get together and create a commission, and you start having these committees. It's not going to happen overnight, but your voices have to be heard, but it has to be heard in a different way, not through art, gathering artifacts. A lot of times, I'll, the way I collect stuff, people call me up and I say, hey, what do you want to do with this? A couple of years ago, a lady had a big box of her grandfather who fought in World War II. So I go over there and I said, ma'am, well, I was just going to take it to the thrift store. I said, ma'am, you don't know what you have. You got documentation, you got pictures. Donate it to, you can either donate it to me or some organization, but to give it to the thrift store or to sell it, somebody's just going to resell it. So to answer your question, we need to start commissions within our local community, and we need to go out to like Warnersville and these other areas and say, hey, there's history here. How do we make it become very relevant?
All right, thank you for those questions. We got a few more moments here, but I do have a question from YouTube, but I'm going to go ahead and answer. I got a partial answer to what was just kind of put out there. I do know from, I can't say, I don't want to say I'm an expert on it, but because I'm not, but I do know that it can be a very heavily involved or laborious process to get a marker or a monument put up. It has to be voted on by the commission or the city council. Then it also has to be voted on by the community, and it has to reach a certain percentage from that community.
That's true.
Now, one of the questions from YouTube was, did you find any evidence of monuments of people of color, not necessarily African American, but underrepresented communities?
Yes, there's one that Mr. Dwight did of a Native American. It talked about it, but I couldn't find any pictures of it. But there are monuments of other ethnic backgrounds, and that's why I pointed out a book I read about the Anoya Gay exhibit. Which perspective do you tell it from the Japanese perspective or the American perspective? You look about the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Do you tell it from the American perspective or the Japanese perspective? And I think that, and I want to highlight some, but I really don't want to get into it. When you think about the Civil War, for instance, okay, they're monuments. But we all know it can evoke emotion, but they're still monuments that tell the history. We don't want to get in, take this down, but I think that to answer your question, yes, there are other sculptures that represent the diversity of cultures in America. It's just, where are those monuments at? And then back to your point, Mr. Rodney, is that those things have to be voted on. There's a marker, William McBride, right in the middle of East Market Street, right by A&T. I was there when that monument up. This is when Mary Yvonne Johnson was the mayor, and it took Dr.
And for my folks in Berkeley, California, Yvonne Johnson was the first African-American female mayor. I believe the first African-American mayor for the city of Greensboro.
Right. And then Dr. Olin Cole, who was he was my department chair when I was in grad school. He worked tirelessly to get that marker up. And it took almost 15, 20 years to even get that marker up to be voted on. But again, people need to know the importance of sculptures and what they represent to be in public spaces.
Right. You mentioned earlier, it's telling a story and sending the message from a time. But I do know in the works, there's an organization, if you're familiar with Brian Stevenson and the EJI. So there's a chapter here of the Guilford GCCRP, Guilford County Community, missing the R. Oh, Lord, I hope they're not listening because I done messed up the acronym, but it's GCCRP. But they are investigating the long documented lynching in Guilford County. They've narrowed down the location, but if once that's kept up, the hope is to have, the end result is not just to put up a marker, you know,
Yeah.
to make people aware, but and do much of what you talked about earlier, but that's one that's in the works. And then we also have one that's going to go up downtown. We had a kind of a kickoff to this event last week for International Women's Day.
Mhm.
So there will be a marker for Gertrude Will, who was instrumental in the women's suffrage movement. That's going to be, I believe, somewhere near South Elm, Eugene, and that's downtown Greensboro. And then also of, I'm going to say Vina Curry. I'm not sure how to pronounce her name. I haven't nailed it down yet, but Lavina Curry, who was an abolitionist, a Black woman who was an abolitionist. And that's going to go up on the campus of Guilford College,
Okay.
also here in Greensboro. And then lastly, right adjacent to our location, Equal Justice Initiative is EJI. That's the GC, Guilford County Community Remembrance Project. See, I get an A. I came back and got the answer right. But the Women of the Shoah, being spearheaded by Victoria Milstein, it's going to look at it's commemorating the sacrifices made by the women who were affected by the Holocaust. And so that's going to be a statue that's going to be erected. It's not going to be raised, but it's going to be on the ground. And it's going to be a self-guided tour. That monument will go up next year in the Bower Park, which is downtown Greensboro, right behind the museum as well. So they're on the way, but like you say, we need more. We need more representation from, you know, all of our underrepresented, marginalized groups. So
Yeah, I was reading in the comment that someone said that it's nice that the A&T 4 statue is at A&T by the Dudley Gallery, but again, this things being in more public spaces. But all of what you're saying is very great. Again, we just need to push the envelope a little bit harder, but doing it a strategic way, so that it's representing, everyone. And so, again, minding our monuments, we need to do that. I mean, I always tell my students, if you want to be involved, get involved in your city and local. Rodney, I've been volunteering with the Greensboro Historical. I remember while I was a traveling trunk, going out to school. So that's a big part of it. And I commend, your people, volunteering. That's what it takes.
Right.
Not your time. Volunteering is shared time to a common objective. And that's why we're here tonight. So again, I want to commend you again for pulling this together and your staff to bring this to light. And I know you have other programs, which I've, shared it with my students, but this is what it takes.
Absolutely. And we thank you for spending some time with us. And thank you to our volunteers as well, Joanna, Joni, and Bianca, and all of our guests who are attending. Tune in next week. And we thank Professor Hooker from A&T for having the discussion on today. And next week, we're going to be joined by Jose Vasquez with Monument Lab. So it's Tuesday, March 22nd at 6 p.m. Remember, you got to register. It's always free, but you got to register to attend. The more numbers we can get out there, the more eyeballs we can get all these programs, the more readily available the funding can be for subsequent programming. So we appreciate any support and all the support that you can give. And thank you all for attending the kickoff session for Minding Our Monuments.
And Rodney, you can share my email or contact information if anybody wants any more information about this, or if of my own work, they can email me.
All right. Thank you all.
Thank you all.
All right.
Hi, Berkeley, California. Thank you all.
Thank you all. Have a good night.
All right, you too.